If you think we live in violent times, then you should see what happened in the Bristol Riots around the early 1800s. Now, I will be hitting you with lots and lots of dates and information, and it could make your ears bleed. So put the kettle on, get yourself a nice slice of cake, and let's see what these rascals got up to around the early 1800s. The Bristol Riots took place on the 29th to the 31st of October 1831 and were part of the 1831 Reform Riots in England. Just 3 days of death and destruction that changed the face of Bristol forever. The riots arose after a reform bill was voted down in the House of Lords, stalling efforts at electoral reform. The arrival of the anti-reform judge Charles Wetherell in the city on the 29th of October led to a protest, which degenerated into a riot. Heavy stuff this. I think we should go back first and see what all the fuss was about. In early 19th century Britain, there were large discrepancies in the size of constituencies in the lower house, the House of Commons. Some seats, so-called rotten boroughs, returned just 2 members of Parliament from a small number of electors. We call them voters now. While seats in the new urban centres such as Manchester had no MPs at all. Hard to believe, eh? In March 1831, an attempt was made by the Whigs, they're a bit like Conservatives on speed, to introduce a reform bill to address the matter. This was defeated in Parliament and the Prime Minister Charles Grey resigned. Annoyingly for him, Grey was returned to office with a majority. Don't you just hate it when that happens? Grey was returned to office in the subsequent general election and introduced a second reform bill. This passed the House of Commons, but was defeated in the Lords on the 8th of October 1831. Bristol now was a city of 100,000 people and was represented by just 2 members of Parliament. It was so simple in those days. Still with me? Jolly good. Stay awake at the back. The rejection of the bill and the second resignation of Grey resulted in a period of political disorder, which has since been characterised as the closest that Britain ever got to a revolution. Inhabitants of cities and towns were so angry at the failure to pass the bill, and there were serious disturbances in London, Derby, Leicester, Yeovil, Sherborne, Exeter, Bath, Worcester, and of course Bristol. Serious disturbances in Yeovil? Blimey, you don't hear that very often, do you? The disturbances in Birmingham were so severe that the British Army's Scots Greys Cavalry Regiment was deployed to the city, but the Brummies eventually packed it in and went home. Crossroads was on the telly and Meg Richardson was having a bad hair day. Full-scale riots erupted in Bristol, Nottingham and Derby, although full-scale stuff never actually happened in Yeovil. They had some cows to milk. The Bristol Recorder, no, not the newspaper, this was a senior judge. The Bristol Recorder, Charles Wetherell, was a noted opponent of the Reform Bill, although he was given a hero's welcome in the city in 1829 for his opposition to Catholic emancipation. The only other time Bristol gave a hero's welcome was the Wallace and Gromit Christmas lights in the 1980s, and they were blown down after 2 days by very high winds.
The fact is, I'm just crackers about cheese.
Back to the script. Charles Wetherell sparked controversy in 1830 for stating in Parliament that the people of Bristol opposed reform. Bad mistake there, Chaz. The city had in fact sent in a petition of some 17,000 names, and that was before the internet, to support reform and hosted large pro-reform public meetings in the first week of October alone. Wetherell himself was MP for the Yorkshire Rotten Borough of Boroughbridge. Boroughbridge, with just 48 electors, that's voters to you and me, was set to be abolished by the Reform Bill, so you can understand why he wasn't a happy bunny. Wetherell was due to attend the Assize Courts of Bristol at the end of October. I've been unable to find why, but I'm guessing he was doing 15 mile an hour in a 10 mile an hour zone. Who knows? So to recap, Before the reforms, there was court voting rights in 56 boroughs of England and Wales, and another 31 to having only one MP. The vote was open to small landowners, tenant farmers and shopkeepers, but not everybody had the vote. The vote had also been given to all householders who paid a yearly rental of £10 or more. This was over £1,000 in real money today, but it was still hard to find in those days, and a voter was still defined in the Act as being a male person. Limited change had been achieved, but for many, it didn't go far enough. The unequal distribution of seats, sorting out the rotten boroughs, and a general tidy-up were all issues that were going to be addressed. So, let's move on to the punch-up. That's what we're here for after all. Woohoo! The Bristol Under-Sheriff had command of only 100 constables and estimated that at least 300 more would be required to deal with the anticipated size of the protests against Weatherall. But there were a few volunteers from the middle classes who were traditionally called upon to provide this service in times of trouble. The magistrates managed to enlist another 119, but many of these were known to have violent tendencies.
Have you seen the size of my knuckle duster?
The magistrates did not order the yeomanry or retired army personnel to be called up. They did, however, clear weapons from the city's gunsmiths just in case of looting. The city's magistrates requested British Army troops to be sent in. The government was reluctant to send any troops, knowing that it would be unpopular with the public. But eventually, the Home Secretary, William Lamb, authorised the deployment of a force of 93 soldiers and to be used only in the case of absolute emergency. During the course of the riots, men of this regiment, recognisable in their distinctive blue uniforms, would be jeered by the crowd, while those of the 3rd Regiment, based locally, were cheered. It's a funny old world. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brereton was commander of the 3rd Dragoon Guards and led the military response into the riots. He was a supporter of reform and after the riots would be accused of having sympathies with the mob. When the troops arrived in the city, the aldermen and magistrates refused to ride at the head of the troops as they crossed into the city boundary as tradition demanded. The officials were fearful that doing so would cause the mob to single out their businesses and shops for looting and arson. The location of Weatherall's entrance into the city had been... That doesn't sound right, does it? No. The location of Weatherall's arrival into the city had been changed for security reasons, but soon became common knowledge as he was met by the mob upon his arrival on the 29th of October. The carriage carrying Weatherall was stoned heavily and he sought refuge at the corporation's mansion house. Violence escalated, particularly after special constables carried out a number of charges on the crowd, one of which led to the death of a member of the public. There were disputes between the dragoons and the constables over the perceived heavy-handedness of the latter. The rioting continued into the night and the mansion house was stormed time and time again. The 14th Light Dragoons attempted to halt the riot and shot one man dead while doing so. Weatherall, however, fled the mansion house via the rooftop to an adjacent building. Getting exciting now, isn't it? The stoning and looting of the mansion house continued from 7 a.m. on the 30th of October, which was a Sunday. Most of the items looted were on eBay by the following Monday.
Ooh, A++, lovely.
Its wine cellar was emptied and the building set on fire. Care was taken to get that the right way round. A charge by the 14th Dragoons on Corn Street against the mob attacking the council house resulted in the deaths of 2 men. After this, there was a short lull in fighting, during which Weatherall escaped from the city disguised as a woman and got 2 offers of marriage before he got to the city boundary. The violence restarted and a mob attacked the town's jails. The few soldiers of the 3rd Dragoon Guards left on the scene were powerless to stop them. The Bridewell Jail, Lawford's Gate Prison and Gloucester County Prison were all overrun and the prisoners freed. Fires were set at Bishop's Place, Customs House, Excise Office and other buildings. Smoke was reportedly visible from Newport, South Wales, if you stood on tippy toes on the kitchen table and used a tasty pair of those newly invented binocular thingies. Chants from the crowd included, "Oh, it's only corporation property," a snappy ditty at the time used to justify the destruction of civic buildings, as well as "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough," and who can forget the classic "Who ate all the pies? Who ate all the pies? Charles Weatherall did." But these reports have not been confirmed. It is known, though, that a number of fireballs of flammable pitch were manufactured for use by the rioters. One rioter even thought about petrol bombs for a while, but he didn't have enough milk bottles, and petrol wasn't to be invented until the 1890s.
I'm going well, I'm going Shell.
Good heavens, I know that voice.
I'm going well on Shell, Shell, Shell.
The destruction caused during the night of the 30th to the 31st of October, in which many private houses were attacked, shocked the citizens of Bristol. Please bear in mind that Bristolians are pretty much unshockable. Just ask any of them about the bus service. The middle classes were provoked into action. Most just rolled their eyes and tutted, but some 3,000 men reported for active duty the following morning. The numbers were at last increasing. An additional 100 soldiers from the 14th Light Dragoons arrived in the city later that day. Their officer, Major Beckwith, took control of the situation. They responded to a rush of rioters on the southern side of Queen Square with a charge by the 3rd Dragoon Guards that effectively quelled the riot. Order was eventually restored on the third day by a combination of a posse of the city's middle-class citizens, military forces, and a passionate TV plea from the people's hero Lewis Hamilton. The latter wasn't really successful, as a telly wasn't to be invented until 1927. Phew, I'm fair worn out. Is that kettle on? So what was the outcome? Well, the riots were the worst in an English city since the 1780 Gordon's riots in London, when gin was rationed. See what I did there? The total death toll is still unknown, but 12 citizens are known to have died in the clashes with the authorities. Many corpses were recovered later from within burned buildings. One of the men sentenced to hang was a retired tradesman whose only crime was to shout encouragement to the rioters. He was singled out by the court for particular punishment because of the respectable position he held in society. Clemency was granted to all but 4 of those sentenced to death after a petition of 10,000 names was presented. This petition included the names of many people whose houses were destroyed in the riot. Some 22 people were transported to Australia and 43 people imprisoned. Captain Warrington of the 3rd Dragoon Guards was court-martialled and cashiered for failing to pass on an important message during the riot. The Third Reform Bill, known afterwards as the Great Reform Act, apparently all 3 of them were called the Great Reform Act, introducing sweeping changes to the electoral system. Local government in Bristol was likewise reformed with the passing of the Municipal Corporations Act, finally passed in 1832. The city's mayor, Charles Pinney, was tried for failing to prevent a riot and a lesser charge of failing to repair potholes on the Portway, but was acquitted. The military commander, Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Brereton, however, was court-martialled on a similar charge, but committed suicide before he could be sentenced. It's all getting a bit iffy now. They were tough days. People had passions and beliefs, and some paid the ultimate price for those passions and beliefs. The decisions that they made all those years ago are the foundations of the society we all enjoy today. This has been a sideways look into the events of the Bristol Riots in 1831. There are many, many books out there that do a far better job than I have, including one called Hot Heads and Heroes by a good friend of mine, Peter MacDonald. And yes, it's still available on Amazon.